Now I get to introduce Dr. Michel Waller, professor of anthropology at Central Oregon Community College, and we overlapped a few years there, about 5 or 6. And I want to read this if I can get it correctly. He has a book out, and it has a little plug on at the back of the book on who he is. I don't know if I can pronounce ethnoprimatology. Ethnoprimatology is the name of the book if you want to go look it up. And it says here that for over 20 years he had experience researching primates with research projects in Africa and Central America. His field studies include chimpanzee-human interactions in Senegal, bonobo-human interactions in war-torn Democratic Republic of Congo. Dr. Waller studied primate socio-ecology and behavior in an effort to better understand the spectrum of factors that have shaped early human evolution, which should be of great importance to all of us. His research focuses on ranging behavior, territoriality, aggression, and tolerance. Would you please welcome Dr. Waller?
Well, thank you. And this is my second Osher talk, and I always love giving these talks because Tom just says, talk about whatever you want. And that gives me an opportunity to dive into some things that I'm interested in, but maybe haven't fully researched in the past. I love that kind of creative freedom in this sense, and so I appreciate that, and thank you all for having me. Let's make sure this thing works here. A little bit more about my background. Like Tom said, I've spent all those fancy big words are really just college words for saying that I chase primates in the woods and hope to catch glimpses of them doing things. And if I'm really lucky, on a good day, I'll be able to collect their poop, and we can get DNA and dietary stuff from that. So it's really a lot of big words to say that I just like being in the jungle, and I've learned a lot in that time. I feel really fortunate to have had those opportunities to go out and chase primates around, and the way that I got into the field was really for conservation at first. I started my academic life as an ecologist and kind of fell into primates, and then being able to tie that into the human evolutionary piece has been a real gift for me. So that's a little bit more about my background. What I'm going to talk to you about today is this idea of the alpha male, right? And I'm going to first ask you to quietly, you don't have to blurt it out or anything, but in this room, who's the alpha?
You're female.
Yeah, we'll get to that. But who would you say, right? And you can look around or you can think about it.
Right now, you.
Yeah, maybe. But I'll tell you why that's wrong here in a bit. It's really a trick question, right? It's really a trick question, and it's only been somewhat recently that we've been taking this term that has started, right? Oh, I think I got a slide out of order here. It started with chickens, right? And the pecking order, and the dominant male and the dominant hen, right? This is where it comes from. I don't know if any of you know about chickens, but they have really small brains, right? And that's going to be kind of a theme that we're going to talk about as we discuss social behavior and dominance hierarchy. The term alpha itself was really brought into animal behavior in the 1940s by a Swiss ethologist, animal behavior study researcher, Rudolf Schenkel, and then that started with wolves, right? And so most people are pretty familiar with the concept of the alpha male in the wolf pack. But even in those contexts, what we see is that that alpha male doesn't succeed on his own. It's a cooperative venture. There's coordination, okay? One of the other really interesting things that I discovered when it comes to primates and the term of alpha, it was first used, as far as I could tell in the research, by U of O professor Paul Simons in 1962, based on his research of Japanese macaques. And I got to overlap a little bit with Dr. Simons when I was a graduate student at U of O, and I got to talk to him quite extensively about his work, but I'd never realized that he was the first to really apply this term to non-human primates. He was quite a character, known for his plaid pants. I don't know if that tells you anything about him. Yeah, way ahead of his time. So what does this term really mean? What does, in animal behavioral studies, what does alpha, how would we define it? And in the simplest terms, it refers to the individual at the top of a social hierarchy, okay? And those traits associated with it include leadership. So there's some decision making. Where are we going, right? What food patch are we going to seek out, right? This leadership position is often maintained via dominance. Okay, that's a word that is very clearly connected to this alpha concept. And that dominant position is maintained through physical strength. Okay, we'll talk about in a moment here body size dimorphism. Does anybody know what I mean by body size dimorphism? What do you think? Yeah, males are going to be bigger than females. Males are bigger than females. And the reason why, of course, is that those males that are bigger can more, they can compete more effectively. And so they are the ones who typically win the competitions, pass on those big genes to the next generation, and the cycle perpetuates itself, right? Smaller males don't tend to get those mating opportunities because they're outcompeted by the bigger males who have greater physical strength due to that size. But it's not just that physical strength and the aggression. And I want to point this out because when I came up with the title for this talk, the fallacy of the alpha male, I was really thinking about humans, okay? But the deeper I dug into it as I was preparing for this talk, the fallacy of the alpha male really can apply to any of these hierarchies that we're going to talk about, even going to chickens, right? Most of the time, there are alliances that are associated with these social positions. It's not, what researchers have found and what we'll discuss is that it's not always the biggest male who runs the show. There are some big males who aren't interested. They just want to hang out and relax. And there are some males who aren't quite as big who are more politically shrewd. So we'll talk about alliance formation and equally as important, breaking those alliances at the right time. So most of you, I'm sure, have probably heard of Machiavellian intelligence, right? The ability to appear to be one thing at one time to all people, and it's oftentimes ascribed to very shrewd politicians. The alpha typically has preferential access to food, which of course is important, but from a genetic standpoint, preferential access to mates. In multi-male, multi-female primate groups, it's like baboons and macaques and chimpanzees, females often incite competition. They don't do this in any behavioral way specifically, but typically non-human primate females like baboons and chimpanzees have sexual swellings, their genitalia. So you've probably seen baboons, they've got those big red hindquarters, right? And most people think that that's their butts. That's not, that's a female, that's her genitalia. And when it gets bright and red like that, it's a signal to all the males. Hey, I'm ovulating over here. Start competing. And she doesn't necessarily sit and watch the competition and, suss out who is, the bigger, the stronger. She just cares who wins. And this is beneficial for her, right? The assumption being that the male who wins has the best genes, will mate with her, and her offspring will inherit the best genes as well. So it's an adaptive strategy for those females, okay? So that's a big one, as well as other resources for chimpanzees. Chimps make a new nest every night, right? It takes about 5 minutes, and they kind of fold these branches together and make a little arboreal platform. And in places where predation is really high, the higher up you get, the more safe you are, right? The lower the nest, the more susceptible you are to leopards, for example. And so that would be a status thing, right? And there are a whole host of different ways in which dominance can be shown. In fact, just off the top of my head, I'm going to call Tom up for a second. Come on up, Tom. In typical chimpanzee societies, right, they groom each other, and grooming is a big thing, kind of front to back. And the subordinate would groom the dominant. Well, at one site, they do it in a very different way. They groom side to side, and they have their hands up here. Go ahead, put your hand up, and put it on my hand. And this would show that Tom is the dominant one because I'm supporting his weight, right? So little things. Thanks, Tom. You make a good chimp.
I've been rehearsing.
Yeah, that's right. All our lives, right? So there are little subtle things like that can really advertise these dominance rankings. Last bit here is that it's hypothesized that the presence of an alpha male actually lends stability to these social groups, right? And in fact, social movement, depending on the species, in some groups it's rather a quick turnover. There's a group of baboons, for example, where there's a new alpha male every 7 months on average, right? But in chimpanzee social groups, it can be years. And what it's hypothesized how it's hypothesized to keep social stability is everybody kind of knows their roles, right? All the males know where they rank in the social group. And that actually works to lower aggression, not increase it. During times of upheaval, when there is a change, that can be a particularly aggressive time. But overall, there is a sense of general stability. This slide was more for me than it was for you all. So the concept of an alpha is dynamic, with individuals potentially rising or falling in rank due to challenges, changes in strength, age, or shifts in social alliances. So we talked about the early use. How do we determine social hierarchies, dominant status? Well, the classical way is through focal animal sampling. All right, and for this demonstration, you all are my primates, right? And over some period of time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend a full day watching each one of you. And every 30 seconds, I'm going to take a note of whether or not you're resting or eating or moving or doing some basic behavior. But then if you do something that shows a dominance hierarchy position, right? I'm going to note that in my little Jane Goodall inspired notebook, right? And that takes a long time to do, doesn't it? Especially for a group of, 50, 60 people, 50, 60 chimps, okay? The typical length of time is about a year to do this. There are other ways we can do this that are more time intensive. Some of my favorite research comes on baboons in the Okanagan, I can never say it right, Delta in East Africa. And they have over years got recordings of several of the vocalizations of all the different individuals. And then they can play them when one group is over here and see responses. So one of the relationships that's quite common for baboons are these male consortships or friendships. Typical baboon social behavior, the alpha male, the highest ranking male, gets the majority of the mating opportunities when females are at their most fertile, okay? And paternity rates vary. Some are as high as 95% for the alpha, but between 50 and 75% is probably about the average. And so what's happening to those non-alpha relationships? Well, what researchers have found is that males are going up to females when they're not in estrus, when they're not ovulating, and being like, hey, let's be friends, in hopes that when she does begin to ovulate, that she'll remember how nice and sweet that male was to her, and he might get some mating opportunities. Oftentimes termed the friends with benefits approach. And so what they did was they recorded a number of female distress calls. And what they found was that males would respond to the distress calls of their friends much more often than they would to just some other female distress call. So it shows the depth of this relationship. I love those studies because it really does demonstrate that each individual can recognize the calls of all the other individuals, which is probably one of the reasons why cognition and intelligence has evolved in primates more so than other animal groups, right? It's the social intelligence that is really required. Not only do I need to know, if I'm a baboon, my relationship to each and every one of you in a group of baboons is known as a congress, which is of course appropriate. And not only do I need to know my relationship to each and every one of you, but I need to know your relationship to each and every other person, right? So this power couple up front here, I know when they're together not to be messed with, right? Oh, but he's on the other side. I'm going to go ahead and steal her food or whatever, right? That's the type of cognition that these social interactions produces. Other ways that we can determine social dominance: mating, right? Who's doing the most mating, right? As far as the males. If there's one male who is mating most often, and that individual is probably the highest ranking. And then of course paternity. And with our development in genetics, we can determine paternity pretty easily using feces or what have you. So those are some pretty easy ways to measure dominance. Of course, we talked about access to food as well. So some shared characteristics of high-ranking males. Well, in non-human primates, body size matters, right? Probably the easiest example of this would be gorillas, right? A male gorilla weighs on average around 450 pounds. A female is 150 pounds, right? So it's very striking. And as I mentioned earlier, the hypothesis for that stark difference is that males have to compete aggressively with other males to ensure their reproductive status. Gorilla social organization is a little different from what we've been talking about. It's a single male, typically, with a group of females. And those females choose that male. He doesn't have to aggressively herd them like we see in some other animals. The females are attracted to that silverback, that body size, those signals of strength and protection. The reason why, of course, is if that male is usurped, is dethroned, and a new male comes in, what is that new male going to do to any infants in that social group? Yeah, he's going to kill them in a behavior we call infanticide. And the reason why is that when females are lactating, breastfeeding, there's a hormonal feedback loop that limits ovulation. Doesn't prevent it. You can still get pregnant while breastfeeding, but it does tend to limit it. So by removing that offspring, that breaks that feedback loop, and the female then begins to ovulate more regularly, increasing his potential genetic fitness. Okay, so it stands to reason that females would choose these bigger, more protective males. A couple of other things that we see, mandrills. I think I had a picture of a mandrill on the title slide. They're the ones with the really bright faces. What's really interesting about them is that as they rise in status, their testes get bigger and their faces get redder. Right? Now there's an interesting question. Is it the rise in status that is triggering these changes, or are the changes triggering the rise in status? I think it's probably the latter, although this paper presents it as the former. Whatever the case, greater testes size would be an important thing, right? In these multi-male, multi-female groups where, yes, males do get preferential mating during peak ovulation, but females will mate with other males throughout her cycle to create paternity confusion, right? So that males are less likely to kill infants. The greater the testes size, of course, the more sperm. And the more sperm a male produces, the greater the likelihood of reproduction. So competition between males isn't just in its more observable form, it's all the way down to the sperm level. There is sperm competition, right? And in fact, human sperm has this ability to, well, does anybody know? I'm not sure I feel comfortable asking this question, but I'm going to do it anyway in the library. How many sperm there are in a single human male ejaculate? And millions. Yeah, 250 million. 250 million. That is enough to get every female in the U.S. pregnant twice, right? But out of those 250 million, only a few hundred actually make it to the egg, right? A lot of those sperm have other jobs, so to speak. Some of it is to change the pH balance in the reproductive tract, but others are thought to go out and seek other sperm and neutralize those. So a sperm is not a sperm. One thing that I learned about while researching for this talk is the facial width to height ratio. And this is measured by measuring the width of the face at the cheekbones and the height of the face from the lower lip to the glabella, which is the point right between the eyes at the brow ridge. And what they found is that there are capuchin monkeys. These are the white-faced capuchin monkeys found in Central and South America. The alpha male tended to have these wider faces, taller faces. And that's thought to, it's hypothesized to be associated with testosterone, right? Testosterone has a whole host of effects on facial morphology, right? typically human males with kind of the broad chin and the bigger brow and the wider face, what we might classically describe as a more masculine face, tend to have more testosterone. I'm a hockey player. I'm from Minnesota originally, so I was thrilled to find a research project that looked at human face to width ratios, width to height ratios in hockey players, and I'll save that for the end. It's pretty fascinating. And then we talked about infanticide a little bit already, right? And so that is an adaptive evolutionary strategy, as tragic as it might seem, but it is a beneficial behavior for males in these groups. Other shared characteristics, I went into this a little bit, but Frans de Waal, who just recently passed away, maybe some of you have read some of his books, he's, almost as famous as a primatologist can be. You've got Jane Goodall right here, but de Waal was probably right below her within the community especially. And a lot of that was based on his 1982 book, Chimpanzee Politics, which I know that there's a copy here in the library because I checked it out 20 years ago or so. And what he essentially found was what I was discussing earlier, that it's not always the biggest or the strongest, that it is those that have that political acumen, those that are able to persuade, coerce, manipulate, to make others do what they want them to do. And again, that has a lot of negative attributes to it, I think, when even saying it up here. But it is a very beneficial skill to have, right? In these complex social groups where they're all competing, the ability to do that effectively can make a big difference from a genetic, reproductive, evolutionary standpoint. So think about millions of years, tens of millions of years of evolutionary history, that those individuals that could use their brains as well as brawn were the ones that were more likely to pass on their genes. And I mentioned a little bit earlier about paternity, 69% of offspring in mandrills, chimps at the Thai forest in Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, about 50%, but range from 38 to 67%, depending on the number of males, depending on the number of females. So there are a whole host of factors that go into paternity, right? But nonetheless, what this all really tells us is that there are a whole host of benefits to being high-ranking, right, for males. More mating opportunities, higher paternity, lower levels of stress overall. Okay, not all the time. Most of our knowledge on stress in non-human primates comes from the work of Stanford neurobiologist Robert Sapolsky, who has some really good books out there. The one that's probably most related to this talk would be a primate memoir. And it talks about his work on baboons in Kenya. And what he found is that when you look at the big picture, lower ranking males have the highest stress. They don't get the feeding opportunities. They're routinely beat up, right? There's kind of this displacement effect. And if you've had siblings, right, when you were little, you've seen it, right? The big one hits the next one hits the next one, and then the little guy at the end suffers the whole cascade of effects. And that happens here as well, right? However, in some baboon groups and chimp groups, when we look at cortisol levels, which is how we measure this by collecting urine. So urine and poop, that's really living the dream. But when we collect urine and measure the cortisol, what we do occasionally find is that it is stressful to be the highest ranking male, right? It's kind of like heavy wears the crown, right? In chimpanzee groups, it's so competitive that everybody's kind of gunning for you at some point because the stakes are so high. What one research paper found was that it's best to be number 2. Right? You get a lot of the benefits of being up there at the top, but not as much of the pressure. Not as much of the pressure. So lower levels of stress overall, higher risk of physical violence, which leads to increased stress. And I talked about Sapolsky's baboons. An interesting anecdote from one of the groups that he studied, they lived near a hunting lodge. And there was a dump where the lodge kitchen staff would throw a bunch of their food. And it was a really great resource for the baboons. They would go there, and it was the highest ranking males that had access to all this garbage. Well, at one point, all those males received bovine tuberculosis and died. So the whole group was now rid of all these high-ranking aggressive males. And the way baboon groups work is that males migrate out of their natal group when they reach breeding age to avoid inbreeding. All the females are related. So you don't want to obviously mate with your sisters or cousins or aunts or what have you. So all the males leave. And new unrelated males come in from all these other groups. And when these new males came in the absence of, with the absence of all these aggressive males, the resident group that remained kind of cooperatively told them, hey, we don't do aggression anymore. We got rid of all those aggressive males and we like it better that way. And Sapolsky went back 6 years later and found the entire group to be far less aggressive, even though there were new males that came in. Right? It really highlights in my mind the importance of culture in these groups. We think of culture as oftentimes a uniquely human thing, but that's not always the case. Okay, so that should give us a little bit of a background on non-human primate social hierarchies. This might be a good time for questions on non-human primates before I go into humans.
Are there any female dominant groups?
There are. So bonobos, which is another group of primates that I've studied, are well known for being female-centric. And the way that their social organization works is that females get together and they create bonds by having homosexual behaviors together. They rub their genitalia together. It's known as GG rubbing. And by making these high quality bonds, which a little deeper than just grooming, they work together to keep potentially infanticidal males out. They live in an area where there's more food. So if there's a group of aggressive males, they just move, right? And so they have evolved these patterns of behavior where they have a far higher level of power than what we see with chimpanzee females. And as a result, males have changed their behavior as well, right? Where in a chimpanzee group, if a male chimp stumbles across an unknown female and her infant, that infant's in trouble. With bonobo males, they'll go up to a female with an infant and they'll play with the infant. Like, oh, look at me, right? Mate with me. If we have any babies, I'll play sweet with your baby too, right? They'll also go to trees that have food in them and they'll be like, hey, ladies, over here there's some food. But if you want to climb up there, you got to give me a little sugar, if you know what I mean, right? So they have a whole host of different strategies. That's evolved. Those are evolved strategies. What's really interesting, and I was going to get to it here in a bit, but I think this is a good time for it, is that a group of Japanese macaques, that's the type of monkeys that Paul Simon studied in Japan, there is an actual female alpha, right, who has risen up the rank just as a male would. And I think that really demonstrates, right? So if you recall back to the first question that I asked, who's the alpha? I think it was you who said the female, right? And I think we tend to think about this as a male thing. And I clearly framed it that way in the title, but I left it intentionally out of that question, right? Because, well, as we'll talk about, it depends on how you measure it.
I read that some monkeys see in black and white and others in color, and that determines also their behavior.
Yeah, yeah. When we look at those primates that use the sexual swellings as advertisements, they're these bright red sexual swellings, and you really can't miss them. It is somewhat analogous to a human male erection, where there is a rush of blood, and that skin starts to swell. I imagine it's really tender to the touch because it lasts for several days. That wouldn't be something you'd be able to recognize if you didn't have color vision, right? And so we tend to see more of the black and white vision in the nocturnal primates. But yeah, there is a difference. Others before we move on? Yeah.
Monkeys don't have the sense of smell that other animals use as a sexual attraction.
Well, some monkeys don't, some monkeys do. I would say that, so lemurs are primates, but they are a special type of primate known as strepsirrhines. And most of our more ancestral primates like galagos, or bush babies is what they're kind of colloquially known as, or lorises, these ones that have been mostly nocturnal tend to have a great sense of smell, right? And they have this filament over the eye known as the tapetum lucidum, kind of like your pets that reflect light. And in fact, ring-tailed lemurs have glands on their wrists that excrete, for lack of a better word, like a pheromone. Ring-tailed lemurs only breed for 1 day out of the year, right? They have to time the births so specifically to when resources are going to be available so that their offspring can survive, that it's 1 day out of the year. And they excrete these pheromones. The males will rub it on their tails, and they waft the tails in the air in a desperate attempt to attract a female. And so, yes, there are some primates that have a sense of smell, but so do we, right? Now, it's not as important as our vision, but it does. We do rely on our sense of smell for a lot of things. Food. I was mentioning earlier, I had to stop and get coffee because I've been out of town the last 4 days, and when I got home, the milk just didn't quite smell like I wanted it to put it into my coffee. But it's almost as if not more important for mating, right? Maybe you've had this experience. You've met up with somebody, and you get along great, right? But if you can't get past the way that person smells, that relationship's in trouble, right? That's a really important factor in attraction. And so we do use it, not quite as much though. Okay, so what about humans, right? What can all this tell us? Well, if we look at the fossil record, I'm going to wander over here for a minute, so I'll try and speak loudly. Let me know if I need to turn it. Oh, does this come off? Oh. Without breaking? Oh, look at this. If we look at the fossil record, right, and here's a male chimp. I don't know how well you all can see this, but notice the big canines. What are those canines there for? Everybody wants to say meat, and they do eat some meat, but this is really social status. This is one of the ways in which non-human primates advertise their competing ability. Gorilla males have gigantic canines. They eat plants, right? They eat leaves and grasses. Okay, so this is really about social status. Okay, and one of the trajectories that we're going to see as we move from something like a chimpanzee to Lucy, to Homo habilis, to Homo erectus, to us, is a decrease in these canine size. Okay, decrease in canine size. That corresponds with an increase in brain size. So does that mean that human males aren't competing because we have small canines? No, of course not. We're just competing in different ways, right? We're just competing in different ways. For additionally, chimpanzees, gorillas, all these non-human primates that I've talked about already, the males are much bigger than the females. What about us? Are males bigger than females? Typically, but the rate is decreasing. The rate is decreasing. There are some non-human primates that males and females are roughly about the same size. In fact, an ape group, the gibbons. Somebody familiar with the gibbons? These are the brachiators. They're just beautiful gymnasts in the forest. I think Portland Zoo has some. I'm not a big zoo guy, but if you go to the zoo, go check out the gibbons. The way they move through the forest is just really remarkable to watch. But males and females are about the same size. What do you think their social system looks like? They're monogamous, or I like to say monogamish, right? They pair up. And if the hypothesis goes, all the males and all the females are paired up, then competition levels are lower, right? Males don't have to be much bigger. So that brings us back to us, right? If males and females are becoming more or less the same size, that suggests to us that, and we can see this in the fossil record, that we are becoming more monogamish, right? More pair bonded and less multi-male, multi-female. Okay. And so that's really the general trajectory of human evolution, is we go from big males with big canines and smaller females to males and females that are roughly approaching the same size and smaller canines. But again, we are competing, aren't we? And we can see this competition a little bit in our tools. Right? So again, most of you have probably heard of Lucy, a set of human remains that were discovered in 1972, I want to say. And she got her name because the researchers were listening to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds on the day she was found. And she lived about 3.2 to 3.4 million years ago. And we don't know for sure if she made stone tools. Okay. I have no doubt in my mind that she used stones as tools. There's a difference in the way that I said that, right? We know chimpanzees do. Chimpanzees will take a rock that they find and crack open something. Or they'll take a stick, insert it into technically a wand, right? A termite wand. I don't know. That's what that's the academic name. Insert it into a termite mound. Termites latch onto the wood and they get a termite snack. I haven't tried it, so I shouldn't knock it, but it doesn't sound good. And so we know that tool use has been around for a long time. Monkeys use tools, and of course there are crows that use tools. So tool use is nothing unique to humans or even primates, but it's certainly taken it to an exponential degree. We do have the oldest stone tools where someone took a rock and another rock, cracked them together to produce some kind of edge. Modified, most of us, if you look at this, if you're hiking along a trail down by the river and you see this rock, you're probably just going to think it's right. You have to look real closely at the fracture paths to recognize it as a tool. The oldest one of those are what we call Lamecquian tools. Lamecquian tools from the site of Lamecqui in Kenya, and they're around the same time as Lucy. We don't know who made them. We don't have what we call association, where we find the tools in the same stratigraphic layer as fossils from a particular species. That's how we connect who made what. We can hypothesize that it was probably something like Lucy, but there's no reason to, that maybe tomorrow somebody digging in that area might find the oldest Homo fossil from that same spot. Right now, the earliest Homo fossil is about 2.8 million years old. So a full 400,000 years after these tools show up. So we just don't know, but we can hypothesize that something like Lucy made those early tools, okay? And if you're just going bashing rocks together, yeah, that's very applicable. So this tool tell you. What do you see about this tool? I'll bring it up here so I can put the microphone down. Don't drop the tool. How's that? What do you recognize? What do you notice about this tool?
Didn't happen by accident.
Didn't happen by accident for sure. We recognize this right away as something altered by a human. One more thing. Point. Yeah, you can, and in fact, there's a lot you can do with this. You can drill, you can perforate, you can saw, you can scrape, you can pulverize, you can bash. This is really like the Swiss Army rock of the Paleolithic. There is a lot you can do with this. It's a multi-tool, right? It's a multi-tool. And as we evolve, we're going to move kind of away from the multi-tool. If you're at home and you got to do something with the Phillips screwdriver, do you go and get your bike tool? Or do you go get a Phillips screwdriver? I go and get a Phillips screwdriver. So we are going to move away from this and become more specialized with our stone tools as we evolve. But this was an immensely important tool, right? And it's associated with Homo erectus. Notice the increase in brain size from Homo habilis to Homo erectus. Yeah?
What is the kind of rock there?
This is a flint. Yeah, this is what's known as an Acheulean hand axe.
You don't usually think of that color.
Yeah, it's really pretty, isn't it? Which brings me to my next point. What do you notice about the shape of it? Fits the hand really well. But what about just in general? There's one word I'm looking for.
Very symmetrical.
Symmetric. That's exactly right. In fact, it's probably more symmetric than it needs to be to do all those things that I talked about. What does that tell us? It's art.
Anal retentiveness has been around.
Yeah, maybe. It could be simply anal retentiveness, or the other hypothesis is that the maker of this tool cared about what others thought about this tool, right? This is, in some people's minds, analogous to the tail of the peacock, right? Why do these male peacocks have such an elaborate train? Attract mates. Yeah. But why is it so attractive? Maybe the peahens don't understand, but we do.
Because our nature, it is ambidextrous too.
Sure. But getting back to the tail of that peahen or peacock, it doesn't help it forage for food or avoid predators. In fact, it's a cost, isn't it, for those things? It makes it less efficient to get food, harder to get away from predators. What that's saying then to all the peahens that are around, I must have good genes. I'm still alive. If I didn't have good genes, I would be starving or eaten. Right? Mate with me, and your offspring will have good genes too.
We can find tools like that in our American Indians.
For sure. Absolutely. So which one advertises higher genetic quality? What's this one, right? This is a signal of cognitive capacity. Art, if you will. Right? So this is an incredibly important tool. And without it, Homo erectus, it's the first human species to leave the African continent. The oldest Homo erectus fossils come from a site called Dmanisi in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, which experienced winters and seasons and cold spells. Without this tool, we probably aren't able to exploit those habitats, right? This is a key to unlocking different areas for humans to migrate into. So it's a really, really important social and subsistence tool. And it's not a surprise that we start moving away from big bodies to bigger brains, And I'd be happy after the talk to hang out and talk about any of these fossils.
I
Yeah,
have one question about
Sure.
that particular tool you were holding.
Mhm.
At one time, there was
let me
a,
pass it around. It's not real.
but that type of thing. But at one time, that was a magnificent tool.
Yeah.
And when the owner eventually died,
Yeah.
do you guys speculate what happened to it? Was it passed on? Was there a fight for it? Was it the
You know,
alpha male took it or what?
it is a spectacular tool, but it only takes about 10 to 15 minutes to make.
Is it
Yeah.
also a weapon?
Hard to say. Hard to say. It's not a projectile, way too big.
Right.
Way too big, and we don't see any evidence for Homo erectus hafting onto like a spear. That comes much later.
I'm just thinking
Yeah.
in hand,
Uh,
head.
Certainly in that case it could be, but we don't have any evidence for that. Yeah. And the thing about stone tools is you don't get that many uses, right? They do tend to break. You know, we're the indigenous folks around here, obsidian. Right? Well, how many shots of an arrow with an obsidian tip you get? You get one, and that thing breaks, right? So you got to be good at making a ton of them. What else? Essentially, there's a change in what is attractive. We go away from males who, as I mentioned, who are big and strong and brutish, being the predominant reproducers, to those males that are creative, that are cooperative, that are intelligent, that are able to develop technology that gets them more food. And we see kind of a feedback loop here, right? So by increasing technology, that gives you more food, which fuels a bigger brain, which allows for more creativity and intelligence, which gives you more technology, which gives you more food, and the cycle spins, right? And we see this really dramatic change in what is and what isn't attractive. And again, it's not a coincidence that it's with Homo erectus that we see the greatest increase in brain size. They show up in the fossil record not long after Homo habilis and have a cranial capacity of about 1,000 cubic centimeters. That's the volume of the skull. Chimpanzees about 350, by the way. Okay, and by the time Homo erectus goes extinct or is replaced by archaic Homo sapiens, essentially Neanderthals and Denisovans and ourselves, they're in our range of cognitive capacity. So this really was a kind of flashpoint for human evolution during that time. Okay, and coincident or not coincidentally, I should say, do females have these big sexual swellings today? No, of course not. Of course not. We as male reproductive competition is changing, so is female anatomy and physiology, right? So is female anatomy and physiology. So human females have lost that sexual swelling. So again, I ask, who's the alpha? Well, it depends, right? Depends on what we're measuring. You know, there might be somebody amongst us who has 10 kids. That seems pretty alpha to me, right? Or maybe there are some millionaires in the crowd. That seems pretty alpha to me. That's definitely not me. So, you know, biggest, is that going to be it? Is it body size? Body size still does matter, okay? People who are taller tend to get offered jobs more often, right? Is it the most partners, most sexual partners? I think about this part down here, the most friends, right? And this is incredibly important for males, right? This is where some of this becomes applicable. Those men who have a real solid social group tend to be healthier, tend to live longer, right? To me, that's success, right? What about the ladies? What about females? Well, I mentioned the female who has risen to alpha status in those macaques. We talked about bonobos and how females run the show there. Typically, when we think about alpha males in humans, it's CEOs or warriors in hunter-gatherer groups. But there is ample evidence to show us that women do that. And if you were to Google alpha male, what you're going to see is a long list of well-dressed, big, buff white guys. And I hope that what I'm showing you here is that it's not quite that simple, right? That, and my own personal opinion is anybody who has to tell you that they're the alpha is probably not the alpha. So evolutionary studies show us that there is not one way to be a successful human, right? Creativity, technology, cooperation. There are a lot of different ways to achieve all the benefits of status without limiting how we describe it to some strict hierarchy or organization. And so that's why I think it's really important when I'm teaching my classes and when I'm discussing these kinds of topics, I don't talk about human nature. Right? That makes it sound as if there's one way to do this or one way to do that. I talk instead about the human condition. Because who we are, how we behave, what our social roles are conditional on a whole host of factors. Our genes, for sure, our upbringing, the foods we ate that day, you know, what our kids did to mess up the house, right? You know, and I try not to make this stuff too personal, right? Because I can look into this and go down some rabbit hole of my own anthropological studies. But I've oftentimes, of course, evaluated my own life and what's been successful and what's not been successful. I tend to dwell on that latter. But for what has been successful is kind of my flexibility, right? On any given day, depending on whom I'm around, I can be down at the D&D, at the dive bar, or I could probably be successful having dinner with the governor, right? And those are the kinds of skills that I think really make for a well-rounded human experience. So I promised you some hockey, and really this is maybe for my own enjoyment. But when I was doing research for this talk, I came across this paper. I mentioned that the male capuchin monkeys that have this particular facial width and height ratio have dominance, and they did this with hockey players in the NHL. And what they found, based on these photos and doing these analysis, is those males that had the more dominant facial width to height ratio had the most penalty minutes. And I thought that was just so good. Now, it should be pointed out that those players in the NHL who have the most penalty minutes don't make the most money. So I don't know if there's a relationship there, but certainly I thought that was pretty interesting. So I think that's everything. Yeah. Any questions? Yeah.
Just the whole shift in view, how we view the alpha. I can't help thinking that in the 60s or wherever, the whole kind of rise of Microsoft and the nerdy people taking
yeah.
over, you know, they must have been ridiculed and whatever growing up because they were in the library or they were, you know, reading, or they weren't the football players and all the things that had the social status. And do you see a real shift in the human condition versus human nature as the nerdy people have like really risen in terms of alpha?
Yeah, I think, you know, if we were a group of chimpanzees and the highest ranking male walked into this room, the rest of us males would be afraid, right? If Bill Gates walks into this room, I'm probably not too scared, right? I might be in awe of, you know, his capabilities, but I don't think I would feel any physical threat. So I think that's certainly part of that. Now, I've gone this whole talk without talking about our former president, right? And that's by design. I certainly don't want to get too political here, but I debated heavily about that clip from where he was in Europe, and there were a whole group of world leaders, and he busted in front of them. You all know that clip that I'm talking about?
Yes.
Well, what we don't talk about is who were those men that he busted in front of, many of whom have more money than Donald Trump does, right? Have worked in business and politics for much longer, right? So the thing about status with humans that doesn't pertain to chimps is that it can be faked, right? It can be faked, right? I could go and, you know, I'm a teacher at COCC, so you can guess how much money I make, right? But I could probably go and take out some money and go rent a sports car for a day, go borrow a really nice suit, and I could fake it. I could fake it. In the long term, usually not always, intelligence can't be faked. It can't be faked. Usually, not always. It can't be faked. And so that's where we see a big difference, right? Most of the time when I talked about DeWall and his chimpanzee politics, he describes that as chimps acting like humans. I would say that when it comes to some of our political leaders, we've got humans acting more like chimps. And by the way, chimpanzees have kind of gotten a little bit of a bad reputation. They are aggressive, and they make horrible pets, and they are wild critters. But one of my favorite all-time observations of chimpanzees in the wild was the first time I saw them using tools in Senegal. It was a male and a female who had kind of snuck away from the group at sunset, and they were termite fishing. And I was like, oh, this is a dinner date. This is a dinner date. They were sweet to each other. They were quiet, and it was not the combustible, you know. I noticed your 2001 T-shirt. You might have to stand up and show that one off. But you know that demonic male hypothesis that would have been taught in anthropology classes. You know, so coming on the heels of World War II, when we had a particularly bleak view of humanity, one of the big hypotheses was what's become known as the demonic male hypothesis, that males are inherently violent and aggressive. And if you remember 2001, A Space Odyssey, Kubrick's vision of life, the rise of humans starts with a male. Well, there's this weird alien monolith that shows up, and the very next day, one of these chimp-like critters grabs an animal bone and starts smashing it on these bones, and that's when the dun, dun, the music from that movie kicks in. And then there's a competition between these two different groups over a water hole. And that same male who was given human aggression from this monolith bashes another male over the head with it and walks on two legs. And that, according to Kubrick and this hypothesis, is the dawn of humanity, right? And we get 7 million years of evolution since then. We know it's probably not quite like that. We know that competition and aggression and these social dominance relationships get a lot of play, right? And in our own media, right? It's a long time been said, if it bleeds, it leads. But what this really does is a disservice to all the cooperative things that we do today. You can't live your life alone. We get so much more done when we cooperate. And we do it billions of times a day. From holding the door open, from picking up somebody's wallet that they dropped, right? To exchanging information. We are far more cooperative than we are competitive. Yes, we compete. We absolutely do, amongst ourselves and as groups. But think about that. As a group, we're competing with other groups. Well, there's cooperation to form that group in the first place. So cooperation is a really, really undervalued element of what it means to be a human. Do you have another question?
I was going to say what I like about this shirt is that Kubrick seems to say that technology is what made humans, and this sort of is saying that art is what makes humans different from other animals.
Yeah.
Maybe it's related to technology.
I think, yeah.
There's a difference between creating a stick and drawing a picture.
Yeah, I talked about that Acheulean hand axe. I'm sure it got around, hopefully to y'all, and got a chance to look at it and how it might be thought of as the first art. Maybe. When it comes to like art as we think of art, cave paintings or scratches or whatnot, it's really quite young. Now that might be a byproduct of it doesn't preserve in the fossil record, right? But it is something that we all do, right? To greater or lesser degrees. Some of us are better at it than others. But I was in high school and college and probably before that, a doodler, right? I would doodle in the margins of my notebooks when I was taking notes. And I was always kind of chastised by teachers for, you're not listening. And I'm like, I am listening. I'm really not paying attention to the doodle, right? And really what I've learned is that doodling is my art brain just working. Nobody's going to hang my doodles in the Louvre, but it shows that it is a part of our brains and that it's important, right? That think about these Paleolithic artists who are doing these extravagant cave paintings, right? That's time away from hunting. That's time away from mating, right? Those are the things that, when it comes to reproduction and the circle of life, are two of the most important. So it had to have been important. It had to have been important. So I'm a big fan of art from an evolutionary perspective.
So, not trying to get real political, but with all your observation and whatever with all of this, do you have any hypotheses of how we've ended up with millions of Americans who don't want to look at facts?
And that's a long answer. Yeah.
What was the question?
Yeah. So I think the broader question is how can one person influence so many, right? And our current political situation isn't the first. You go to somebody like Hitler, right? At the really extreme end, right? And how did one person or one group of people affect so many who, probably really at their heart good people to make make these decisions. And it's that cult of personality. It's that Machiavellian intelligence. We don't want to ascribe intelligence to some of these leaders, right? Especially in current days. But there's something there that that connects with certain people. And what that is might vary from leader to leader. I think that at its heart, we've really got a failure in our education system, right? And education, our education system. We have, in the more recent past, but even going back some time, focused too much on maybe standardized tests. And what I'm noticing with my students these days is the inability to think critically about certain things. And that doesn't mean like to tear something down, but to problem solve, right? You know, I've got a 16-year-old, and I swear he's really quite smart for the most part. But there are times where he'll ask me a question that has an answer that's so blatantly obvious that I you know, if you don't tell them what exactly to do from point A to point Z, they can't do it all the time. And I think earlier generations had a little bit more grit, and we've kind of lost a little bit of that. So I don't know. There's probably a whole litany of things that go into that cult of personality element. Mm-hmm.
Part of it is just what you explained, like the Proud Boys and those fellows are feeling their loss of dominance of being an alpha male, and so they latch on to another one that they think is an alpha male.
Yeah.
That doesn't explain the women to me.
Yeah. No. We do, and this is something that I maybe should have incorporated into the talk a little bit more, but we do have a male problem in this country, right? And if you look at, you know, the houseless situation, if you look at, you know, people who are struggling, it's predominantly men. Not always, of course, but it's predominantly men. And I don't know why they, you know, every individual out there has their own situation. But a part of it is probably due to the fact that in the case of some white males, right, who have had it at the top for so long, right, that the expectation is that I'm still at the top, whereas in today's society, being a white male isn't enough. That's not an automatic pass to social status. You have to work because everybody else is working and having access to education that they were refused in past generations or were limited to. And you know, mental health and drug addiction and all those things are mental health and drug addiction are part of those things as well. But I do think that there's an element of inherited status that has since been rejected that may contribute to that. Yeah.
Well, don't you think some of it is the problem of we like to tell ourselves we're rational beings and then demonstrate immediately that that's not the case?
No, we make bad decisions after bad decisions.
So that's some of, can explain some of what's going on is you look at decisions that some people have made in support of the former president, that if you look at it rationally in terms of their well-being, if you're measuring it by access to resources and a good life kind of thing, that you're making decisions, give power to someone who doesn't give a damn about it.
Yeah.
And that's not a rational position if you're doing sort of strict logic, but if you start to throw emotions in and you say, well, this person makes me feel good.
Yep. And that's...
I'll say to hell with anything else. You know, that's what I want.
That's it, right? And we've maybe all heard that phrase, I won't always remember what you said or what you did, but I'll remember how you made me feel, right? And so we are emotional animals. That can be a hard barrier to break.
One thing with your hypothesis and your studies is that the groups of animals you were studying were developing in isolation, mostly in Africa or wherever. And now humans, because of transportation, and we have groups of humans that used to be more isolated, and now suddenly we're interacting with a lot more groups of humans that are very different from us. And how does that come into this mix?
Yeah, I think this is all relatively new for humanity, right? The way that people and ideas can move across the globe at a relatively quick rate. We're still trying to figure that out. And I think about racism, right? And okay, so imagine you are, and my family's mostly from Norway, right? And very likely you wouldn't see anybody who looked terribly different from you, right? And if you're in the middle of Norway and you see a black human walking towards you, your initial reaction is going to be, that's not my family, that's not anybody I know, and therefore it might represent a threat, right? I know intuitively that that person isn't part of my kin, okay? And I want to be clear, this isn't to justify racism, but to explain maybe why we have that somewhere in us. And it's been said, and I'm not sure, I don't know, but that we all have some racism to some degree. Well, we know better now, or we should, and maybe this is where education can do us some help, that we are all the same species despite these very minuscule genetic differences that account for some pretty easily observable physical differences, that we are all traceable back to a small group of humans cruising around in Africa some 300,000 years ago, right? And that this concept of race, if you remember my last OLLI talk, we talked about how humans like to categorize things, right? Whether it's gender or race, or we talked about even the concept of what is a species. These are all human categorizations, and nature doesn't care about those things. And so we should know better than that we all do have far more in common with each other than we do have differences. But like I said, this is a relatively recent thing. We've been dealing with it since colonialism started some 500 years ago, and that's really not that long. So and the internet especially, most of us in here remember a time before the internet, and I wonder how many of you would go back to that time, right? Yeah, I think a handful of us would, right? And there are good things and bad things, but we're still learning how to use it. And we're still in the infancy stage, in my opinion, with that. And genetics too, right? We're learning new things about our genetics all of the time. And so, think about how far we have come. I tend to be an optimist, right, with certain things over the last, I'll be 51 here in a couple weeks. And, I never thought we'd have a black president when I was a kid. I never thought in my lifetime we'd see gay marriage approved. And so we have to remember some of the steps we have taken along the way. Doesn't mean we don't have a lot of work to go, but I'm convinced that over time, we will see some of those walls that this, and walls aren't the right thing. Some of the challenges of this new globalized world will fall away as we figure things out. Because we are pretty smart. We just got to act like it.
regarding competition, when we were all young, there were fewer than 2 billion people on the planet, and now we've got 9 billion. Is that an absolute determinant in your mind for competition remaining a really crucial part of politics and environment and everything else?
Yeah, we're always going to compete, right? And it might be for a parking spot, right? Or trying to get into the roundabout. You really see people's true colors in these roundabouts in Bend. There's a social study just waiting to I'm definitely a different person in the roundabouts. But, that gets into big questions about agriculture and our food production techniques. And, agriculture is a dramatic shift in how humanity has lived. For 99% of our history, we lived as hunters and gatherers, and we've had agriculture again for a relatively short amount of time. Probably going back 15,000 years or so, but it's only been 2,000 years since most people have been reliant on agriculture. So it's a relatively new thing as well. And these things are all interconnected. As it stands right now, my understanding is that we still have plenty of ways to make food for everybody. So 9 billion, we probably won't be competing for food. And that doesn't mean there's enough food for everybody because of political reasons. That's our will to feed everybody. But there is enough food if we chose to feed everybody. Where I think this shows up, at least for me, where I see it the most, is in competing for jobs, right? I look around and some older folks here probably remember the time when a high school diploma was enough to go get a good paying job. You'd get married at 21, 22, buy a house, and that was your life for the next 40 years. Well, these kids today, a bachelor's degree is barely enough. Most jobs these days that aren't part of service or tech are requiring a master's degree. And so we're really getting hyper specialized with what people can do from a labor perspective. And that I think is really tough.
We see more entrepreneurs.
Yeah, you have to. You have to. Yeah. Yep. So that's, I think, a real challenge for the younger people moving up today, that, the credentialism required. You are starting to see it in higher education. It's what's known as micro-credentials, right? You finish one thing and you get a couple of letters next to your name. And I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I get it.
Yeah, but wait till your plumbing grows up.
Yeah. Yep. Well, the pendulum will shift, right? And plumbers will make more money, and we'll get more plumbers, and they'll work themselves out to some degree. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Yeah.